The millionaire always ignored the young woman until she saved his life. Her last request made him break down in tears. Have you ever heard that saying that money doesn't bring happiness? Well, Alexander Sterling probably never believed that. He was the kind of man who looked at the world as if it were a chessboard. And he, of course, was the king. Not the kind of king from ancient history, but the type who walked around in a tailored suit, a pricey watch on his wrist, and a smile that looked more like a do not disturb sign. Alexander was a tycoon, the owner of a fortune that made eyes sparkle, not just the envious ones. His company was everywhere. Skyscrapers, TV commercials, even those apps you accidentally download. Everything had the Sterling seal. But you know how it is. The higher you climb, the colder it gets up there. And Alexander? Well, he was ice cold. His routine was as predictable as the sunrise. He woke up before 5, drank black coffee while reading newspapers no one else read, and arrived at the office before the rest of the world even stirred. In the building where he worked, there was an entire team of people whose only job was to ensure that everything was perfect for him. From the air conditioning set at just the right temperature to the letterhead papers perfectly aligned on his desk, it was as if time itself obeyed his commands. But among all these well-oiled gears, there was Sophie Lane. Sophie. She was a janitor on the main floor of the building. She wore simple uniforms, old sneakers, and always pushed a cart full of cleaning supplies. Sophie was the kind of person who went unnoticed, like a tiny detail in a giant painting. To Alexander, she was invisible, or almost. Sophie had her own dreams, of course, dreams that didn't fit within the marble corridors of that imposing building. She liked to observe people while she cleaned, watching hurried executives, anxious secretaries, and sometimes even someone crying in the restroom. Every life inside that place seemed like a closed book, and Sophie loved imagining what was written in the pages. One day, something different happened. Alexander was leaving a particularly tense meeting. His face was red, and he was speaking on the phone in a tone that could melt glass. Sophie was in the corner, changing out the trash in one of the bins. When he passed by, he didn't even blink. It was as if she were just part of the furniture. But for some reason in that moment, Sophie felt something strange in the air. A chill, maybe, or maybe it was just the air conditioning. Later that same week, fate decided to shake up the chessboard. Alexander was in his car, heading home after a long day. He stopped at a traffic light, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. Across the street, a hooded man watched his every move. The scene was as clear as the sound of rain against a window. The man reached into his coat. Something metallic, something that glinted under the dim streetlight. Before anything could happen, Sophie was there. Yes, Sophie. She had just left a nearby store carrying a bag with bread and milk. When she saw the man raise his arm, she knew. Without a second thought, she ran. She ran as if her life depended on it. And, in a way, it did. With a scream that echoed through the street, she threw herself in front of Alexander. The sound was deafening, the impact brutal. Sophie hit the ground, clutching her injured arm. The man disappeared into the crowd before anyone could react. Alexander stepped out of his car, stunned. His impeccable suit was now stained. He looked at Sophie, who was breathing heavily, and for the first time in years, he was speechless. Why was all he could say. Sophie, her voice weak, replied, "Because no one deserves that." She managed to ask for one thing before being taken to the hospital. Visit the orphanage on the outskirts, please. Alexander didn't understand. Of course not. How could he? But for some reason, he promised. He promised because in that moment, he realized there was something in Sophie that he had never imagined, something that made him question everything he thought he knew about the world and about himself. As the ambulance disappeared into the distance, Alexander stood on the sidewalk, staring at the horizon. For the first time in a long while, he felt something that wasn't control. It was doubt. It was curiosity. It was perhaps the beginning of something greater. But this story is just beginning. And what happens next? Well, that's another conversation. One moment, he was sitting in his armored car, safe behind the dark glass, and the next, he saw the reflection of his own mortality in the eyes of a stranger. But Sophie was different. She didn't have time to think twice. When she saw that man raise his arm, she simply acted. It wasn't about heroism, at least not consciously. It was instinct, pure and simple. She ran as if she were fleeing from something bigger than fear. And when she threw herself in front of Alexander, it was as if time had stopped. The gunshot echoed through the street like thunder. Sophie hit the ground, clutching her wounded arm. Blood ran fast, staining her simple blouse. But she didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just looked at Alexander with an expression that mixed pain and determination. It was as if she had known this would happen, as if she had been waiting for this moment her whole life. Alexander stepped out of the car, stunned. He didn't know what to do. His brain, always so sharp, seemed to freeze. He looked around, searching for the hooded man, but he had already disappeared. Then his eyes returned to Sophie. She was lying there on the ground, breathing heavily but still conscious. "Why?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Why did you do that?" Sophie gave a faint smile, as if the question was silly. "Because no one deserves that," she replied simply. At that moment, something inside Alexander changed. He had always seen people as pieces in a game. Pawns, knights, rooks, each with a specific function. But Sophie was none of that. She was human, real, and for the first time, he felt that. Before the paramedics arrived, Sophie managed to say one more thing. With a weak voice, almost a whisper, she asked, "Visit the orphanage on the outskirts, please." Alexander frowned. "Orphanage? What orphanage?" But Sophie was already slipping into unconsciousness. The paramedics rushed in, pushing Alexander aside as they placed Sophie on a stretcher. He stood there, watching as the ambulance drove away, its red and blue lights cutting through the darkness of the night. What did she mean by that? Why an orphanage? And why would she, a janitor he barely knew, do something like that for him? The questions swirled in his mind like leaves in a whirlwind. He tried to push them away, but they kept coming back. Sophie had saved his life, and now he had a promise to keep. A promise that, for some reason, felt more important than any contract or business meeting. The next day, Alexander decided to go to this orphanage. He didn't quite know why. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was something deeper, something he couldn't quite understand yet. Either way, he got in his car and drove to the outskirts of the city, a place he had never visited before. When he arrived, he was shocked. The orphanage was an old building with peeling walls and broken windows. Children played in the yard, wearing patched-up clothes and worn-out shoes. It felt like a completely different world from the one he was used to. A world where money didn't buy happiness, but where happiness still existed, even in small doses. An elderly woman came to greet him. She introduced herself as Donna Clara, the caretaker of the place. "You must be Mr. Sterling," she said, offering a tired but sincere smile. "Sophie talked about you a lot." Alexander's eyes widened. "She did? But I didn't even know who she was." Donna Clara shook her head. She knew who you were, and, in a way, that was enough for her. As he walked through the orphanage, Alexander began to understand. Sophie wasn't just a janitor. She was a volunteer here, helping the children with their homework, bringing food when she could, even telling them bedtime stories. To these kids, she was a hero, someone who made a difference, even with so little. One of the children, a little girl about 7 years old, handed Alexander a letter. "Sophie told me to give this to you if something happened," she said, with a seriousness that felt out of place in someone so young. Alexander took the letter with trembling hands. He didn't know what to expect. Did Sophie know this would happen? Or was it just a precaution? He opened the letter slowly, as if afraid of what he was about to read. The words were simple, handwritten in careful penmanship. "Dear Mr. Sterling, if you're reading this, something must have happened to me. First of all, I want you to know that I didn't do this for recognition or reward. I did it because I believe everyone deserves a chance to be better, including you. This orphanage is special to me. It's where I grew up after my father died. It's where I learned that the world can be cruel, but it can also be kind. I want you to see that with your own eyes. Maybe, just maybe, you'll find something you lost a long time ago." Alexander lowered the letter, feeling a weight in his chest. He didn't understand everything, but one thing was clear. Sophie knew something about him, something he had forgotten, or maybe something he had never wanted to face. As he looked around, watching the children play and laugh, he realized something. These kids had so little. In fact, they had almost nothing. And yet, they smiled. They dreamed. They lived. And Sophie was part of that. She was the glue that held this place together. But what did Sophie want him to see? What did she want him to find? These questions kept echoing in his mind as he drove home. He knew he needed to find out more. He needed to understand what Sophie was trying to show him. And more importantly, he needed to figure out why she had chosen to save him. This story is far from over. In fact, it's just beginning to take shape. The next step, well, that depends on Alexander. And of course, on Sophie. Because even wounded, she still had so much to teach. Alexander was not the kind of man who usually lost sleep. He always slept like a rock, with no dreams to disturb him or worries to keep him awake. But that night, after visiting the orphanage, his brain felt like an engine that wouldn't shut off. Sophie's words in the letter echoed in his mind like a song stuck on repeat, and he couldn't stop thinking about what she meant by something you lost a long time ago. What had he lost? And why did Sophie know that? The next morning, he returned to the orphanage. Not because he felt he had to, but because something inside him, something he couldn't explain, pulled him back. It was as if the place was an invisible magnet, drawing him towards something he didn't yet understand. When he arrived, the children were already awake. Some played in the yard, others chased after worn-out soccer balls, and a few sat in a circle listening to Donna Clara tell stories. Alexander stood still for a moment, observing it all. It was strange, but there was something there that he had never seen before. It was life, simple, pure, and uncomplicated. Not the kind of life he was used to, filled with meetings, commitments, and numbers on spreadsheets. This life was different. It was made of laughter, hugs, and small acts of kindness. Donna Clara saw him and walked over with a warm smile. "You came back," she said, as if she already knew he would. "The children will be happy to see you. I just wanted to understand more about Sophie," Alexander replied, hesitantly. "She talked so much about this place in her letter. I want to know who she really was." Donna Clara nodded, as if she had been expecting this question. Sophie was special, she began, her voice gentle. She grew up here after her father died. It was hard for her, of course. She was just a little girl when it happened. But even so, she never let sadness define her. She was always a light for the other children. Even after she left to work, she kept coming back. She worked during the day and spent her afternoons here, helping however she could. Alexander frowned. But why? Why would she do that? She barely had enough for herself. Donna Clara smiled, as if the answer was obvious. Because Sophie knew what it was like to be invisible. She knew what it was like to need help and have no one around. So she decided to be the person she had once needed. Do you understand? Alexander didn't know what to say. He had never thought about it that way. To him, the world was divided into two types of people: the strong and the weak, the winners and the losers. But Sophie didn't fit into either category. She was something completely different, something he couldn't name. The children began to gather around, curious. One of them, a skinny boy about 10 years old, looked up at Alexander with wide, bright eyes. "You're the man Sophie saved, right?" he asked bluntly. Alexander nodded, feeling slightly uncomfortable. "Yeah, that's me." The boy grinned proudly. "She always said you were important. She said you could do good things if you wanted to." Those words hit Alexander like a punch to the gut. He didn't know how to respond. How could Sophie think that about him? He was cold, calculating, selfish. At least that's what he had always believed about himself. But now, standing in front of these children, he wasn't so sure. Another child, a girl with long braids, handed him a drawing. It was a simple picture made with colored pencils. It showed Sophie and Alexander together, surrounded by happy children. In the corner of the paper, she had written, "You can be the hero too." Alexander held the drawing in his hands, feeling something tighten in his chest. He wasn't a hero, at least not in the traditional sense, but maybe there was something in him that he had yet to discover. Something Sophie had seen, even when he couldn't. As he walked through the orphanage, Alexander started noticing details he had previously overlooked. There were pictures on the walls showing Sophie with the children in happy moments. In one, she was helping a little girl learn to read. In another, she was laughing while teaching a group of kids how to plant flowers in the small garden. Each picture was proof that Sophie had touched lives in ways he had never imagined. And then he found something that changed everything. At the back of a room that seemed to be used as storage, there was an old box with the name Sophie Lane written on the lid. Inside, there were letters, drawings, and old documents. Among them, there was a photograph that caught his attention. It was an image of Sophie as a child, standing next to a man he immediately recognized. His heart stopped. The man in the photo was Henry Lane, an old business partner of Alexander's. A man he had betrayed years ago. A man who, after losing everything, had taken his own life. Alexander felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. He finally understood. Sophie wasn't just a cleaning lady. She was Henry Lane's daughter, the daughter of the man whose life he had destroyed. The connection was clear now. Sophie had known who he was from the beginning. She knew what he had done to her father, and yet she had chosen to save him, chosen to give him a second chance. Alexander staggered out of the orphanage, feeling as if the weight of the world had just crashed down on him. He didn't know what to do with this information. All he knew was that his perception of himself and the world had changed forever. He needed to find Sophie. He needed to understand why she had done what she did. And more importantly, he needed to face the demons he had been ignoring for so long. But before that, He had to decide what to do with what he had just discovered. The past was knocking at his door, and he could no longer run from it. Alexander drove back home as if on autopilot. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, but his mind was far away, trapped in a storm of thoughts and memories he had buried years ago. The photograph he had found in that old box wouldn't leave his mind. Sophie standing next to her father, Henry Lane, the man whose life he had destroyed without hesitation, the man who had trusted him and paid the price for it. He stopped the car in front of his building, but didn't get out immediately. He just sat there, staring into nothing, as flashes of the past invaded his mind like lightning in a dark night. He remembered Henry. He was an honest, hard-working man, someone who truly believed in the power of business to change lives. But Alexander? Well, Alexander was different. He had never been driven by noble ideals. To him, business was war, and he was willing to do whatever it took to win. The betrayal had come at a critical moment. Henry had invested everything in a project that promised to revolutionize the industry, but Alexander saw an opportunity. He manipulated numbers, made secret deals, and when the right moment came, he pulled the rug out from under Henry's feet. His partner lost everything: the company, his savings, his reputation. And weeks later, the world learned that Henry Lane had taken his own life, unable to cope with the ruin. At the time, Alexander had felt no remorse, or at least he pretended not to. He justified his actions by saying it was the price of success. But now, sitting in that car, he realized that was a lie. He had always known what he had done. He had always known he had destroyed lives. He had just chosen not to think about it. And now Sophie, she had known who he was from the beginning. She knew what he had done to her father, and yet she had saved his life. Why? How could someone forgive something like that? How could someone see goodness in a man like him? The question swirled in his head like a hurricane, making him dizzy. He needed to talk to Sophie. He needed to understand. But before that, he needed to face himself. And that was harder than any business deal or high-stakes meeting he had ever faced. The next day, he went to the hospital where Sophie was being treated. The place smelled of disinfectant and stale coffee, and the sound of machines monitoring patients echoed through the halls. When he entered the room, Sophie was awake, sitting up in bed with a tired but serene expression. She looked at him and gave a faint smile. "You came," she said, as if she had already known he would. I had to," Alexander replied, hesitantly. He pulled up a chair and sat beside her. "I found out something about you," Sophie nodded, as if she had been expecting this. "I figured you would, sooner or later." "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Why did you save my life, knowing what I did to your father?" Sophie was silent for a moment, as if carefully choosing her words. "Because I am not my father," she finally said. "And you are not the man who betrayed him. At least, not completely." Alexander frowned, confused. "What do you mean by that?" "I grew up hearing stories about you," Sophie continued. "My mother used to talk about how you and my father were friends at first, how you had big dreams together. I know something changed. Something turned you into the man you are today. But I also know that part of that man is still in there, somewhere. I saw it at the orphanage. I saw it in the little things you started to notice." Alexander lowered his head, unable to meet her gaze. He felt like he was being taken apart piece by piece. "But I destroyed your father's life," he murmured. "How can you forgive me for that?" "Forgiveness isn't forgetting," Sophie replied with surprising firmness. "It's moving forward. It's giving a chance for something new. I saved your life because I believe you can be better that you can fix the things you've broken. But that's up to you. Those words hit Alexander like a direct blow to the heart. He had always thought the past was something that couldn't be changed, that his mistakes were permanent marks, scars that would never fade. But Sophie was offering him something he had never expected, a second chance. "I don't know how to do that," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I've spent so long being this man. I don't know how to be different." "Start small," Sophie said, giving him a gentle smile. "You've already taken the first step by coming here, by wanting to understand. That's more than many people ever do." Alexander remained silent for a long time, absorbing everything Sophie had said. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There was a lot of work to be done, both inside himself and in the world around him. But for the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. When he left the hospital, something inside him had changed. He was no longer the same man who had walked in. It was as if Sophie had planted a seed inside him, a seed that was slowly beginning to sprout. He knew there was still much to face, many harsh truths to confront, but he also knew he wasn't alone. Back at the office, Alexander took action. He called his team and announced that he would be donating a significant portion of his fortune to social causes, starting with the orphanage where Sophie had grown up. Some of his executives were shocked, others skeptical, but Alexander didn't care. For the first time, he was doing something beyond profits and spreadsheets. Meanwhile, Sophie continued recovering in the hospital. She knew there was still a long road ahead, both for herself and for Alexander. But she also knew that the real work was just beginning. Fixing the past wasn't something that happened overnight. It was a process full of ups and downs. And as Alexander began rebuilding his life, and maybe even his soul, he realized something important. Redemption wasn't a destination. It was a journey filled with difficult choices, but also with infinite possibilities. The days turned into weeks, and Alexander began to realize that change wasn't just about grand gestures or strategic decisions. It was something deeper, more intimate. It was like peeling away layers of who he had been to discover who he could become. And that journey was far from easy. There were moments when he wanted to go back, regain absolute control over everything, as he always had. But there was something different now, something he couldn't ignore. Sophie was slowly getting better. She could already walk around the hospital with the help of crutches, and her smile was becoming more frequent. Whenever Alexander visited her, she always had something to say, something that made him think. It wasn't direct advice or sermons. They were simple, yet profound observations that seemed to open doors within him he didn't even know existed. "You know," Sophie said one day, looking out the hospital window, "sometimes when you plant a seed, it takes a while to see the results, but that doesn't mean you should stop watering it." Alexander smiled awkwardly. He was beginning to understand what she meant. The changes he was trying to make, in the orphanage, in the company, in himself, wouldn't happen overnight. It required patience, and perhaps even more importantly, it required trusting the process. But not everything was calm. In the business world, news of his new initiatives began to spread. Some praised his shift in attitude, calling it visionary and courageous. Others, however, were furious, especially his old allies, those who had profited from his aggressive practices in the past. They saw his actions as a betrayal, a threat to the status quo. One of these allies was Victor Kane, a man Alexander had known for years. Victor was the kind of person who only cared about profit without worrying about the collateral damage. He had always been loyal to Alexander. Until now, when he heard about the changes Alexander was implementing, he immediately called. "What the hell are you doing? Victor asked, his voice full of irritation. "You're throwing everything away, everything we built." "I'm trying to build something new," Alexander replied, surprisingly calm. "Something worth it. This is madness." Victor shot back. "You're going to lose everything. Your investors will abandon you. Your reputation will go down the drain. Do you really think these good deeds will make up for years of greed?" Alexander hesitated for a moment. He knew Victor was partly right. There were risks involved, and he couldn't predict all the consequences of his choices. But he also knew he couldn't go back to the way things were. That life, that version of himself, was no longer enough. "I'd rather lose everything than keep being who I was," he finally said. "If it means I have to start from scratch, then so be it." Victor scoffed, incredulous. "You're going to regret this," he warned before hanging up. That conversation left Alexander deep in thought. He knew he'd face resistance, but hearing those words from someone so close was like a bucket of cold water. Was he doing the right thing? Or was he just being naive? The next day, he went to the orphanage again. He needed some clarity, something that seemed impossible to find at the office. When he arrived, the children ran to greet him. Some of them already knew him by name and even played with him. It was strange, but comforting. He never imagined that children could like him, much less trust him. Donna Clara greeted him with a warm smile. "You look tired," she commented as they walked through the garden. "I am," he admitted. "Things are complicated." She nodded, as if she perfectly understood. Change is never easy, especially when you're used to doing things one way. "That's exactly it," he sighed. "I spent so much time being someone who now seems wrong. How can I fix that?" Donna Clara stopped walking and looked at him with a serious but kind expression. "You can't fix the past, Alexander. No one can, but you can choose what to do with it. You can let it define you, or you can use what you've learned to do something better." Those words echoed in Alexander's mind as he drove home. He knew Donna Clara was right. The past was unchangeable, but the future was still unwritten. And he had the power to decide what it would be. In the days that followed, Alexander began to get more personally involved with the orphanage, not just sending money or resources, but actively participating. He helped with daily activities, from painting walls to teaching the children how to play chess, a game he mastered but now saw in a different light. To him, chess had always been about strategy and control. Now he began to see it as a metaphor for life. Sometimes you have to sacrifice pieces to achieve something greater. The children loved his presence. They saw him as a hero, someone who came from the big, powerful world to help them. Alexander didn't feel like a hero, but he enjoyed being there. He liked seeing the smiles on their faces, hearing their laughter. It was something money could never buy. Meanwhile, Sophie continued to recover. She was almost ready to leave the hospital, and Alexander knew he needed to prepare something special for her. He organized a small party at the orphanage, inviting the children, Donna Clara, and some people Sophie loved. It was a simple celebration, but full of meaning. When Sophie arrived, supported by her crutches, she was moved. The children sang to her, and Donna Clara gave a brief but touching speech. Alexander watched everything from a distance, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time: genuine happiness. "You know," Sophie told him later, as everyone ate cake and talked, "you're changing, Alexander. You're becoming someone I always knew you could be." He smiled awkwardly. "I still have a long way to go." "We all do," she replied, her eyes shining. "But the important thing is that you're walking." Those words were etched in Alexander's mind. He knew there was still much work to be done within himself and beyond. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. He was learning how to be human again. Life has a peculiar way of testing people, doesn't it? Just when you think you're finally in control, that things are starting to fall into place, the universe shakes everything up to remind you that nothing is as simple as it seems. That's exactly what happened to Alexander. The following weeks were an emotional roller coaster. He was beginning to feel more comfortable with his new choices. Helping the orphanage, trying to be a better person, building bridges instead of walls. But as they say, when you start fixing the past, it tends to knock on your door, demanding more answers. And that's exactly what happened. Victor Kane was not the kind of man who took no for an answer. He always had a plan B, and probably a plan C, D, and E as well. When Alexander challenged his predatory practices and began changing the rules of the game, Victor saw it as a declaration of war. And like any good strategist, he decided to strike back. One morning, while Alexander was in his office reviewing plans to expand the company's social programs, his assistant rushed in. "Mr. Sterling," he said, looking concerned, "you need to see this." Alexander looked up, intrigued. On the computer screen was a bombshell news article. Victor Kane had announced a massive merger between several competing companies, creating a conglomerate that directly threatened Alexander's empire. It was as if Victor had declared open war, using money and influence to choke Alexander's business before he could solidify his changes. "He's trying to destroy me," Alexander murmured, more to himself than to his assistant. "What are we going to do?" the assistant asked, nervous. Alexander hesitated for a moment. He knew he could fight back the same way, using aggressive tactics, manipulating the market, doing whatever it took to protect his interests. After all, he was good at it. But something inside him resisted the idea. He didn't want to be that man again. Not after everything he had been through. "There's only one thing to do," he finally said. "We're going to face him head on, but not like before. This time, we play fair." The assistant widened his eyes, incredulous. "Play fair? Against Victor Kane? He'll crush us." "Then we'll have to be smarter," Alexander replied, with a determination that even surprised himself. "And we'll need help." Help! That word echoed in Alexander's mind as he got into his car and drove to the hospital, where Sophie was recovering. He knew she had a unique insight, a way of seeing solutions where no one else could. Besides, she understood the kind of people they were dealing with, people who only cared about winning no matter the cost. When he arrived at Sophie's room, she was sitting in bed, reading a book. When she saw him, she smiled. "You look worried," she said, closing the book. "I am," he admitted, sitting beside her. "Victor Kane is trying to destroy me. He's formed an alliance that could wipe out everything we've built." Sophie frowned, thoughtful. "And what do you plan to do?" "I want to face him," Alexander replied. "But this time, I want to do it the right way. No dirty tricks, no manipulation. Just honesty." Sophie smiled, as if approving the idea. "That's brave. But you do know Victor won't play by the same rules, right?" "I know," Alexander sighed. "That's why I need your help. Can you think of anything we can use against him? Something he won't expect?" Sophie remained silent for a moment, thinking. Then her eyes lit up. "What if you used his own greed against him?" Alexander tilted his head, curious. "How?" "Victor is obsessed with power and control," Sophie explained. "But he's also predictable. He always acts based on insider information. Right? What if you planted false information? Something that makes him make the wrong move?" Alexander smiled, impressed. "That's brilliant, but it has to be subtle," Sophie warned. "If he realizes it's a trap, he'll strike back even harder." "Understood," Alexander said, standing up. "I'll start working on it immediately." In the following days, Alexander and Sophie carefully crafted a plan. Using discreet contacts and strategic information, they created the illusion of financial weakness in Alexander's company. They planted rumors that he was on the verge of bankruptcy, unable to compete with Victor's new conglomerate. It was a risky gamble, but they knew Victor wouldn't be able to resist the opportunity to land the final blow. And, as expected, Victor walked straight into the trap. He started making moves, trying to acquire Alexander's assets at low prices. But at the last moment, Alexander revealed the truth. All the rumors were false, and he had secured support from external investors willing to sustain his company. Victor's attack failed, leaving him exposed and weakened. The victory was sweet, but Alexander knew it wasn't the end. Victor was a dangerous adversary, and he wouldn't give up so easily. There would be more confrontations ahead, more battles to fight. Meanwhile, Sophie continued to recover. She was almost ready to return to the orphanage, and Alexander knew he needed to prepare something special for her. He organized a small welcome-back ceremony, gathering the children and Dona Clara to celebrate her return. It was a moment of unity, of celebrating life and resilience. But deep down, Alexander knew there was still much work to be done. The fight against Victor was only one part of the story. He still had to face his own demons, fix the mistakes of the past, and keep building something truly worthwhile. The atmosphere was tense, like the heavy air before a storm. Alexander knew that the battle against Victor Kane was far from over. Victor's initial defeat had been a strong blow, but not a decisive one. Men like Victor don't fall easily. They recover, adjust their strategies, and come back stronger. And that's exactly what happened. Victor was not the kind of man who accepted defeat. He was proud, vindictive, and relentless. When he realized he had fallen into Alexander's trap, his anger spilled over into a series of public attacks. He started spreading rumors about Alexander, trying to discredit him in the eyes of investors and the public. "Alexander Sterling is losing control," the headlines read. "His days of glory are numbered." But Alexander was no longer the man he used to be. He didn't let the provocations shake him. Instead, he decided to face Victor directly and transparently. He called a press conference, something he had never done before, to clear up the accusations and reveal the truth behind Victor's manipulations. "I know who I am," Alexander said, standing before a crowd of journalists and cameras. "And I know who Victor Kane is. He represents everything that is wrong in the business world: greed, exploitation, and a complete lack of ethics. I have chosen a different path, a path that prioritizes people, not just profits, and I will not let him stop me from following it." Alexander's words echoed like thunder. Some applauded, others hesitated, but everyone was impressed by his courage. It was as if he were declaring war, not just on Victor, but on the very system he had sustained for years. Meanwhile, Sophie remained his greatest support. She was back at the orphanage, now, helping the children and overseeing the new programs Alexander had implemented. But she was also working behind the scenes in the fight against Victor. Her sharp mind and keen insight were invaluable, and Alexander trusted her completely. "You need to strike where he least expects it," Sophie suggested one evening as they discussed strategies in Alexander's makeshift office. "He's used to dealing with opponents who play by the same rulebook as he does. But you can do things differently." Alexander smiled, recognizing the wisdom in her words. "And what do you suggest?" Sophie thought for a moment, then her eyes lit up. "Use the truth. Expose his secrets. Show the world who he really is." That idea resonated deeply with Alexander. He knew Victor had skeletons in his closet, fraudulent contracts, illegal practices, abuses of power. It was time to bring it all to light. With Sophie's help and a loyal team, Alexander began investigating Victor's business dealings. It wasn't easy. Victor was careful and had many powerful allies. But piece by piece, they started to uncover the truth. They found incriminating documents, testimonies from victims, and evidence of financial crimes that could bring Victor down for good. Now, it was time to act. Alexander organized a public meeting, inviting not only the press but also regulators and legal authorities. It was a grand event held in a packed auditorium. Victor was there, sitting in the front row, wearing a confident smile. He thought this was just another one of Alexander's tricks, another failed attempt to challenge him. But he was wrong. When Alexander stepped onto the stage, silence filled the room. He began presenting the evidence, one by one, exposing Victor's crimes without hesitation. It was like watching a house of cards collapse before everyone's eyes. Journalists scribbled frantically, cameras captured every detail. And Victor looked like the ground was crumbling beneath his feet. "This is a lie," Victor shouted, standing up from his chair. "All of this is fabricated." But no one believed him. The evidence was irrefutable. By the end of the presentation, regulators announced they would launch a formal investigation into Victor and his conglomerate. It was the end of the road for him. Victor stormed out of the auditorium, furious, surrounded by security and reporters. Alexander watched him go with a mix of relief and sadness. He didn't feel hatred for Victor, only pity for someone who had built his entire life on such fragile foundations. After the victory, Alexander returned to the orphanage. He needed to see Sophie to share that moment with her. When he arrived, the children ran to hug him, as they always did now. Sophie was in the garden, tending to the plants the children had been growing. "You did it," she said, smiling. "I'm proud of you. I couldn't have done it without you," Alexander replied, sincerely. "You were my compass on this journey." Sophie shook her head. "You've always had that compass within you. You just needed to find it." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the children play. It was a simple scene, but full of meaning. There, among those children who represented hope and the future, Alexander realized something important. He wasn't just fixing the past. He was building something new, something that would last far beyond him. The following days felt like a long exhale after a deep dive. Alexander finally felt like he could breathe again, as if a massive weight had been lifted off his shoulders. Victor Kane was out of the way, or at least out of a position to cause more harm, and Alexander's business was beginning to stabilize once more. But that wasn't all. He realized that something more important was happening inside him. He was truly changing. Sophie was also in a period of recovery. She was almost fully healed from her injuries and was back at the orphanage with more energy than ever. It was as if saving Alexander had given her a new mission in life, to help him rebuild both as a man and as a businessman. They were an unlikely but complementary pair. Sophie brought the sensitivity and human vision that Alexander had always ignored, while he provided the resources and influence necessary to make things happen. "You know," Sophie said one day as they walked through the orphanage halls, "sometimes I wonder how different things would be if my father were still here." Alexander looked at her, surprised. They rarely spoke about Henry Lane directly. It was a delicate subject, full of pain and difficult memories. But now, Sophie seemed ready to open that door. "I wish I had met your father," Alexander said sincerely. "He must have been an incredible man." Sophie smiled, her eyes shining with emotion. He was kind, Hardworking, always concerned about others. But he was also a dreamer. He believed the world could be better. Even when things got tough, Alexander lowered his head for a moment. Thoughtful. He knew he had betrayed those dreams, that he had destroyed Henry's trust and, consequently, his life. But at the same time, he knew he couldn't change the past. What he could do was honor that memory in some way. "I want to continue his work," Alexander said at last. "I want to use what I've learned from you, from all of this, to build something he would have approved of." Sophie looked at him, surprised but also with a hint of pride. "That's beautiful," she said simply, "but don't do it just for him. Do it for yourself, too." Those words stayed with Alexander. It was true. He wasn't doing all this just to redeem the past or to make up for the mistakes he had made. He was doing it because for the first time, he felt it was the right thing to do, because he wanted to be better, not just for others, but for himself. In the months that followed, Alexander intensified his efforts to transform his company into something more than just a money-making machine. He started investing in social projects, from education programs to sustainability initiatives. Every decision was made based on positive impact, not just profit. And Sophie was there every step of the way, helping him navigate the complexities of the social and human world. The children at the orphanage also began to see Alexander differently. He was no longer just the rich man who showed up occasionally with big checks. He was someone who truly cared, who asked their names, who played with them, and even took part in daily activities. To them, he was a hero, someone who came from the big, powerful world to help them. But not everything was perfect. There were moments when Alexander had doubts, when he questioned whether he was going far enough or fast enough. There were days when the weight of the past still caught up with him, reminding him of everything he had done. But Sophie was always there to calm him, to remind him that change doesn't happen overnight. "You know," Sophie said one evening as they watched the sunset in the orphanage's garden, "there's no such thing as perfection in this life. What matters is that you're trying. And that's already more than most people do." Alexander smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude for having her by his side. "I don't know what I would do without you," he admitted. Sophie laughed softly. "I think you'd find another way. You're stronger than you think." They sat in silence for a moment, just watching the sky change colors. It was a peaceful moment, full of quiet understanding. But at the same time, there was an unspoken tension between them, a connection that went beyond friendship, but that neither was ready to name. However, they both knew there was still much work to be done. The orphanage needed more support. Alexander's company was still in transition, and the world outside remained full of challenges. But they also knew they were on the right path. Together, they were building something bigger than either of them could have imagined. Time has a peculiar way of putting things into perspective. Sometimes it feels like the days drag on, each second a weight to be carried. Other times, time flies, and you realize that what once seemed impossible is now a part of your routine. That's exactly how Alexander felt as he looked back and saw how much had changed, not just in the world around him, but within himself. He was sitting on a bench in the orphanage garden, watching the children play under the warm afternoon sun. It was a simple scene, yet full of life. Laughter echoed in the air, mixed with the sound of running feet on the grass, and the occasional shout of "tag" or "faster." For Alexander, this place had become more than just a social project. It was a constant reminder of what truly mattered. Sophie was there too, sitting beside him, a peaceful smile on her face. She seemed different now, lighter, more confident, as if she had finally found her place in the world. They had been through so much together in the past months. Challenges, confrontations, moments of doubt and triumph. And now, here they were, sitting side by side, sharing a comfortable silence. "You know," Sophie said, breaking the quiet moment, "I used to think happiness was something that came from the outside, that I needed certain things, money, recognition, security, to feel complete." Alexander looked at her, intrigued. He had never heard Sophie speak about herself in this way before. She had always been so reserved, so focused on others. But now, she continued, "I realized that happiness comes from within. It's a choice, a decision to see the good. Even when the world seems against you." Those words struck something deep in Alexander. He thought about all the times he had searched for happiness in the wrong places. In power, in wealth, in material achievements. He thought about how those things had never filled the emptiness inside him, how he had always felt like something was missing. And now, finally, he understood why. "Happiness isn't something you achieve," Sophie added, as if reading his thoughts. "It's something you create, with small gestures, with genuine connections, with the impact you leave in the world." Alexander nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. He knew Sophie was right. His entire life, he had chased success as if it were a trophy to be won. But now, he realized that true success wasn't in what he accumulated, but in what he shared. It wasn't in the power he wielded, but in the good he did. "I would never have understood this without you," he said, his voice slightly unsteady. "You showed me a path I didn't even know existed." Sophie smiled, her eyes shining with emotion. "It wasn't just me," she replied. "You always had that capacity within you. You just needed someone to remind you." They fell silent again, watching the children play. Every laugh, every smile seemed to echo the changes that Alexander and Sophie had made together. The orphanage was thriving now. Thanks to their efforts, more children were being welcomed, more families were receiving support, more lives were being transformed. But Alexander knew it wasn't enough. He wanted to do more. He wanted to ensure that the legacy he was building would last far beyond him. So he made a decision. He called Sophie for a private conversation, something he had been planning for a while. "Sophie," he began, hesitant, "I want to do something big, something that really makes a difference." She looked at him, curious. "What do you have in mind?" "I want to create a support center for underprivileged children," he explained with an enthusiasm that even surprised himself. "A place where they can have access to education, health care, opportunities, everything they deserve but often don't have." Sophie widened her eyes, impressed. "That's incredible," she said, a huge smile spreading across her face. "But that's a massive project. Are you ready for this?" "I am," Alexander replied firmly, "and I want you by my side. None of this would be possible without you." Sophie shook her head, moved. "Of course, I'll be with you every step of the way." In the following months, Alexander and Sophie worked tirelessly to turn that idea into reality. They gathered resources, mobilized partners, and engaged the community. It was a collective effort, something that brought people from all walks of life together. And finally, the grand opening day arrived. It was a spacious, modern building designed to be welcoming and functional. There were classrooms, medical offices, recreational areas, and even a library filled with books. When the doors opened for the first time, children ran inside, marveling at everything they saw. It was as if a new world had been opened for them. Alexander and Sophie stood there, side by side, watching with tears in their eyes. They knew this was only the beginning. There would be more challenges ahead, more battles to fight. But they also knew they were on the right path. At the end of the day, as the children played and explored the new space, Alexander and Sophie sat on a bench in the center's garden. It was a moment of reflection, of gratitude. You know, Alexander said with a calm smile, I always thought success was about what you achieve. But now I know that true success is about what you leave behind. Sophie nodded, a sparkle in her eyes. And what you're leaving behind is something that will change lives forever. They sat in silence for a moment, taking in everything they had built together. It was an indescribable feeling, a mix of fulfillment, gratitude, and hope. True wealth is not found in money or power, but in the connections we create and the positive impact we leave on the world. Redemption and personal growth are possible when we choose to face our mistakes and seek a purpose greater than ourselves. This story at last had come to an end, but its impact, the impact of Alexander and Sophie, would live on for generations. Because in the end, true legacy isn't in what you accumulate, but in what you share. It isn't in the power you wield, but in the good you do. And above all, it is in the lives you touch along the way.